Hi guys, it's Dakota here with the Power of Stories, and in this video I want to bring up one of the steamier tools in the storytelling tool belt. Now, believe it or not, in good stories, romance can be more than just two characters getting together. Or more than, as I like to call it, an author arming one of their audience's ships with cannon. Romance is all over the place in stories we consume, because love, lust, desire, and heartbreak are large parts of the human experience. But we're not going to be covering just romance in general. We're going to cover good romance. Specifically, we're going to go over the use of romance in stories to strengthen theme. I'll be doing this primarily by demonstrating the use of symbolism in the romantic subplots of some of my favorite stories. It's also worth pointing out that, for the most part, I will be covering the use of romance in stories outside of the actual romance genre. The point here is to show how romance subplots and symbolism can strengthen a story's theme, not how the romance can drive the entire story, which is what the romance genre is for. It exists for the sake of the romance. I'm going to be covering the use of romance as an enhancer of story, not its use as the main focus of the plot. Alright, with those details out of the way, let's get started. Using romance as a tool in narrative has been around for ages. Storytellers have used romantic tension, subplots, and symbolism as a way to enhance a story's appeal since stories were first told. Mythologies conceived thousands of years in the past and from all around the world show this in both obvious and subtle ways. Romance plays integral roles in some of the most ancient stories, like the Iliad or the Epic of Gilgamesh. This trend continued on throughout history to the present day, and the most famous examples of it are enshrined as some of our most cherished fictional classics. So, romance symbolism is nothing new, but each subsequent time and place in which it's used tells us something about that time period and the stories being told. For instance, American westerns, both in novel and film form, have often used the symbolism of their female leads, choosing between the rough, wild cowboy and the civilized eastern man, as a symbolism of the choice between the wild, untamed allure of total freedom and the less free but more stable and secure choice of civilization. This was a symbolism that was captivating for generations struggling with the concept of manifest destiny. But let's move on to the present. There are many examples of both good and bad use of romance in our current storytelling landscape, including, in my personal favorite niche, the science fiction and fantasy genre. But how do we see what constitutes good and bad use? The answer is the stories that resonate with us, that feel profound, though we have a hard time explaining how or why. Those are generally the stories that have used symbolism subtly and effectively. Sometimes good symbolism is used in concrete fashion, such as Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time, where each of Randall Thor's romances point to a different fact of his life. Min to his peasant roots, Aviendha to his Aiel ancestry, and Elaine to his current and future authority. Sometimes good symbolism is a bit more subtle and vague, such as in Fate's Stay Night, where each of Shiro Emiya's love interests represent a different part of his struggle with his ideals. Saber, the inherent beauty and virtue of his dream, Rin, the struggle with an inherited ideal not his own, and Sakura, the clash of pure ideals with a complicated reality, and the pathologies associated with a dogmatic ideology. This subtle type of romance symbolism tends to be more about the nuance and complexities of a story's themes, and it's best suited for a story where the storyteller wishes to leave some agency to the audience, and each individual's personal interpretation. Unfortunately, by virtue of good symbolism being a reality, that means that the opposite is also true. Poor use of romance can be seen in stories that are off-putting, that feel disingenuous or pandering. They're not subtle or compelling, there's a faint sense of propaganda about them that taint the entire experience, or ham-fisted style that leaves nothing up to interpretation. Adam Taurus from the American animated show Ruby is an unfortunate victim of this. An instance where the show writers took a villain that showed a lot of promise as a compelling character and quickly devolved him into a romance subplot devoid of any substance or meaning. In the first few seasons, it looked like we might get a complex portrayal of a historically oppressed and deeply scarred man trying to right the world's wrongs. A man who struggles with how to effect change and crosses the line into villainy to achieve it. Boy, glad we dodged that compelling bullet. Instead of the question, freedom fighter or terrorist, we got... Oh, he's just a huge douche. Just another extremely flat, extraordinarily ham-fisted critique of toxic masculinity. Awesome. Look, I'm not saying you have to have complex or even particularly subtle symbolism to be effective. I mean, Twilight is one of the most successful book series on the planet, and its romance is essentially nothing but sexual fantasy. Do you prefer to get controlled by a cold-blooded sadist or dominated by a beast? Not knocking your kinks, ladies, just pointing out that simplistic symbolism, while it doesn't create the most compelling or nuanced stories, can be used effectively.
You serious?
The point here being that the audience of Twilight wants and is fine with simplistic sexual symbolism, because it's a romance, so sexual or romantic titillation of some kind is the entire objective. But let's leave bad romance alone and talk about what the best type of romance symbolism looks like. It fulfills 3 roles. It reinforces the themes of the story as a whole, it reinforces the individual character arcs, and it doesn't allow the characters to become a simple puppet of the symbolism. One of the best uses of romance I have ever seen in a story is in Code Geass, because it fulfills all 3 of these requirements. Let's take a look at this fantastic anime for examples on how romance can be used to great effect. Shirley, Colin, and C2 all have symbolic parts to play in the overarching theme of the story, which can be summed up as consequentialism versus deontology. Or, in layman's terms, the ends justify the means versus dogmatic adherence to both law and duty. That main theme is played out both on the macro scale of factions and nations, and on the micro level in character relationships. But the cool thing here is that the romance subplot between Lelouch and his 3 love interests mirrors the theme, with one representing pure adherence to heroism and its associated flaw of naivete, one representing the allure of violence, revenge, and evil in achieving change, and one representing a desired balance of the two. The second symbolic role each character plays is in relation to character arcs, both Lelouch's and their own. Each represents and reinforces a part of who Lelouch is and who he becomes, since his character arc is ultimately about becoming who he really is, not who he wishes to be and not his worst impulses. A man who has incorporated his shadow and become a more realistic whole. Shirley, Colin, and C2 also reinforce their own character arcs, with Shirley ultimately remaining true to herself despite betrayal, Colin breaking away from justifications and fantasies to find her own path, and C2 coming to terms with who she is and what she wants. But the cool thing about all this symbolism is that it doesn't consume the characters, something that happens often in stories driven by motifs and philosophy. It can become all too easy to let the symbolism and meta-narratives trap characters into predetermined paths that make them feel wooden, flat, or one-dimensional. Despite the many symbolic roles they play, Shirley, Colin, and C2 are unique characters who have compelling depth and motivation outside of the meta-narrative played out by symbolism. Shirley chooses who to love despite ample reason not to. Colin chooses to become her own person and fight for what she believes. C2 chooses to accept herself for who she is. They have character agency. They're not slaves to the symbolism, but drive the symbolism itself. This is probably the hardest part of romance symbolism, or any symbolism, to pull off in a story. But we'll wrap up the Code Geass example there. I don't want to go into too many details because of spoilers, but I've already made a video covering the romance in Code Geass in depth. So if you want to see what masterful use of romance in a story looks like, go check out that video. The link is in the description below. Just be aware that it's full of spoilers. Alright guys, that wraps up my breakdown on romance symbolism. Remember, good romance reinforces the theme of the story as a whole, reinforces the individual character arcs, and doesn't allow the characters to become slaves to the symbolism. I hope this was all useful in illustrating how romance can be used to strengthen a story's themes. What stories have you noticed use romance to good effect? Give me your thoughts in the comments below. I'm Dakota Kemp, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.